Section 3 of Kazan by James Oliver Curwood. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Leonard Wilson. Chapter 3. McCready Pays the Debt. For a long time after he had uttered those words, McCready sat in silence beside the fire. Only for a moment or two at a time did his eyes leave Kazan. After a little, when he was sure that Thorpe and Isabel had retired for the night, he went into his own tent and returned with a flask of whiskey. During the next half-hour he drank frequently. Then he went over and sat on the end of the sledge, just beyond the reach of Kazan's chain. "Gotcha, didn't I?" he repeated, the effect of the liquor beginning to show in the glitter of his eyes. "Wonder who changed your name, Pedro? And how the devil did he come by you? Ho, if you could only talk!" They heard Thorpe's voice inside the tent. It was followed by a low, girlish peal of laughter, and McCready jerked himself erect. His face blazed suddenly red, and he rose to his feet, dropping the flask in his coat pocket. Walking around the fire, he tiptoed cautiously to the shadow of a tree close to the tent, and stood there for many minutes listening. His eyes burned with a fiery madness when he returned to the sledge and Kazan. It was midnight before he went into his own tent. In the warmth of the fire Kazan's eyes slowly closed. He slumbered uneasily, and his brain was filled with troubled pictures. At times he was fighting, and his jaws snapped. At others he was straining at the end of his chain, with McCready or his mistress just out of reach. He felt the gentle touch of the girl's hand again, and heard the wonderful sweetness of her voice as she sang to him and his master, and his body trembled and twitched with the thrills that had filled him that night. And then the picture changed. He was running at the head of a splendid team, 6 dogs of the Royal Northwest Mounted Police, and his master was calling him Pedro. The scene shifted. They were in camp. His master was young and smooth-faced, and he helped from the sledge another man whose hands were fastened in front of him by curious black rings. Again it was later, and he was lying before a great fire. His master was sitting opposite him with his back to a tent, and as he looked there came out of the tent the man with the black rings, only now the rings were gone and his hands were free, and in one of them he carried a heavy club. He heard the terrible blow of the club as it fell on his master's head, and the sound of it aroused him from his restless sleep. He sprang to his feet, his spine stiffening and a snarl in his throat. The fire had died down, and the camp was in the darker gloom that precedes dawn. Through that gloom Kazan saw McCready. Again he was standing close to the tent of his mistress, and he knew now that this was the man who had worn the black iron rings, and that it was he who had beaten him with whip and club for many long days after he had killed his master. McCready heard the menace in his throat and came back quickly to the fire. He began to whistle and draw the half-burned logs together, and as the fire blazed up afresh, he shouted to awaken Thorpe and Isabel. In a few minutes Thorpe appeared at the tent flap, and his wife followed him out. Her loose hair rippled in billows of gold about her shoulders, and she sat down on the sledge close to Kazan and began brushing it. McCready came up behind her and fumbled among the packages on the sledge. As if by accident, one of his hands buried itself for an instant in the rich tresses that flowed down her back. She did not at first feel the caressing touch of his fingers, and Thorpe's back was toward them. Only Kazan saw the stealthy movement of the hand, the fondling clutch of the fingers in her hair, and the mad passion burning in the eyes of the man. Quicker than a lynx, the dog had leaped the length of his chain across the sledge. McCready sprang back just in time, and as Kazan reached the end of his chain, he was jerked back, so that his body struck sidewise against the girl. Thorpe had turned in time to see the end of the leap. He believed that Kazan had sprung at Isabel, and in his horror no word or cry escaped his lips as he dragged her from where she had half fallen over the sledge. He saw that she was not hurt, and he reached for his revolver. It was in his holster in the tent. At his feet was McCready's whip, and in the passion of the moment he seized it and sprang upon Kazan. The dog crouched in the snow. He made no move to escape or to attack. Only once in his life could he remember having received a beating like that which Thorpe inflicted upon him now, but not a whimper or a growl escaped him. And then suddenly his mistress ran forward and caught the whip poised above Thorpe's head. "Not another blow!" she cried, and something in her voice held him from striking. McCready did not hear what she said then, but a strange look came into Thorpe's eyes, and without a word he followed his wife into their tent. "Kazan did not leap at me," she whispered, and she was trembling with a sudden excitement. Her face was deathly white. "That man was behind me," she went on, clutching her husband by the arm. "I felt him touch me, and then Kazan sprang. He wouldn't bite me. It's the man. There's something wrong." She was almost sobbing, and Thorpe drew her close in his arms. "I hadn't thought before, but it's strange," he said. "Didn't McCready say something about knowing the dog? It's possible. Perhaps he's had Kazan before and abused him in a way that the dog has not forgotten. Tomorrow I'll find out. But until I know, will you promise to keep away from Kazan?" Isabel gave the promise. When they came out from the tent, Kazan lifted his great head. The stinging lash had closed one of his eyes, and his mouth was dripping blood. Isabel gave a low sob, but did not go near him. Half blinded, he knew that his mistress had stopped his punishment, and he whined softly and wagged his thick tail in the snow. Never had he felt so miserable as through the long, hard hours of the day that followed, when he broke the trail for his teammates into the north. One of his eyes was closed and filled with stinging fire, and his body was sore from the blows of the caribou lash. But it was not physical pain that gave the sullen droop to his head and robbed his body of that keen, quick alertness of the lead dog, the commander of his mates. It was his spirit. For the first time in his life it was broken. McCready had beaten him long ago. His master had beaten him, and during all this day their voices were fierce and vengeful in his ears. But it was his mistress who hurt him most. She held aloof from him, always beyond the reach of his leash, and when they stopped to rest and again in camp, she looked at him with strange and wondering eyes, and did not speak. She, too, was ready to beat him. He believed that, and so slunk away from her and crouched on his belly in the snow. With him a broken spirit meant a broken heart, and that night he lurked in one of the deepest shadows about the campfire, and grieved alone. None knew that it was grief, unless it was the girl. She did not move toward him, she did not speak to him, but she watched him closely, and studied him hardest when he was looking at McCready. Later, after Thorpe and his wife had gone into their tent, it began to snow, and the effect of the snow upon McCready puzzled Kazan. The man was restless, and he drank frequently from the flask that he had used the night before. In the firelight his face grew redder and redder, and Kazan could see the strange gleam of his teeth as he gazed at the tent in which his mistress was sleeping. Again and again he went close to that tent and listened. Twice he heard movement. The last time it was the sound of Thorpe's deep breathing. McCready hurried back to the fire and turned his face straight up to the sky. The snow was falling so thickly that when he lowered his face he blinked and wiped his eyes. Then he went out into the gloom and bent low over the trail they had made a few hours before. It was almost obliterated by the falling snow, Another hour, and there would be no trail, nothing the next day to tell whoever might pass that they had come this way. By morning it would cover everything, even the fire, if he allowed it to die down. McCready drank again out in the darkness. Low words of an insane joy burst from his lips. His head was hot with a drunken fire. His heart beat madly, but scarcely more furiously than did Kazan's when the dog saw that McCready was returning with a club. The club he placed on end against a tree. Then he took a lantern from the sledge and lighted it. He approached Thorpe's tent flap, the lantern in his hand. "Ho, Thorpe! Thorpe!" he called. There was no answer. He could hear Thorpe breathing. He drew the flap aside a little and raised his voice. "Thorpe!" Still there was no movement inside, and he untied the flap strings and thrust in his lantern. The light flashed on Isabel's golden head, and McCready stared at it, his eyes burning like red coals, until he saw that Thorpe was awakening. Quickly he dropped the flap and rustled it from the outside. "Oh, Thorpe! Thorpe!" he called again. This time Thorpe replied. "Hello, McCready. Is that you?" McCready drew the flap back a little and spoke in a low voice. "Yes. Can you come out a minute? Something's happening out in the woods. Don't wake up your wife." He drew back and waited. A minute later Thorpe came quietly out of the tent. McCready pointed into the thick spruce. "I'll swear there's someone nosing around the camp," he said. "I'm certain that I saw a man out there a few minutes ago when I went for a log. It's a good night for stealing dogs. Here, you take the lantern. If I wasn't clean fooled, we'll find a trail in the snow." He gave Thorpe the lantern and picked up the heavy club. A growl rose in Kazan's throat, but he choked it back. He wanted to snarl forth his warning, to leap at the end of his leash, but he knew that if he did that they would return and beat him. So he lay still, trembling and shivering, and whining softly. He watched them until they disappeared, and then waited, listened. At last he heard the crunch of snow. He was not surprised to see McCready come back alone. He had expected him to return alone, for he knew what a club meant. McCready's face was terrible now. It was like a beast's. He was hatless. Kazan slunk deeper in his shadow at the low, horrible laugh that fell from his lips, for the man still held the club. In a moment he dropped that and approached the tent. He drew back the flap and peered in. Thorpe's wife was sleeping, and as quietly as a cat he entered and hung the lantern on a nail in the tent pole. His movement did not awaken her, and for a few moments he stood there staring. Outside, crouching in the deep shadow, Kazan tried to fathom the meaning of these strange things that were happening. Why had his master and McCready gone out into the forest? Why had not his master returned? It was his master and not McCready who belonged in that tent. Then why was McCready there? He watched McCready as he entered, and suddenly the dog was on his feet, his back tense and bristling, his limbs rigid. He saw McCready's huge shadow on the canvas, and a moment later there came a strange, piercing cry. In the wild terror of that cry he recognized her voice, and he leaped toward the tent. The leash stopped him, choking the snarl in his throat. He saw the shadows struggling now, and there came cry after cry. She was calling to his master, and with his master's name she was calling him. "Kazan! Kazan!" He leaped again and was thrown upon his back. A second and a third time he sprang the length of the leash into the night, and the babiche cord about his neck cut into his flesh like a knife. He stopped for an instant, gasping for breath. The shadows were still fighting. Now they were upright. Now they were crumpling down. With a fierce snarl he flung his whole weight once more at the end of the chain. There was a snap as the thong about his neck gave way. In half a dozen bounds Kazan made the tent and rushed under the flap. With a snarl he was at McCready's throat. The first snap of his powerful jaws was death, but he did not know that. He knew only that his mistress was there, and that he was fighting for her. There came one choking, gasping cry that ended with a terrible sob. It was McCready. The man sank from his knees upon his back, and Kazan thrust his fangs deeper into his enemy's throat. He felt the warm blood. The dog's mistress was calling to him now. She was pulling at his shaggy neck, but he would not loose his hold, not for a long time. When he did, his mistress looked down upon the man and covered her face with her hands. Then she sank down upon the blankets. She was very still. Her face and hands were cold, and Kazan muzzled them tenderly. Her eyes were closed. He snuggled up close against her, with his ready jaws turned toward the dead man. Why was she so still, he wondered. A long time passed, and then she moved. Her eyes opened. Her hand touched him. Then he heard a step outside. It was his master, and with that old thrill of fear of the club, he went swiftly to the door. Yes, there was his master in the firelight, and in his hand he held the club. He was coming slowly, almost falling at each step, and his face was red with blood. But he had the club. He would beat him again, beat him terribly for hurting McCready. So Kazan slipped quietly under the tent flap and stole off into the shadows. From out the gloom of the thick spruce he looked back, and a low whine of love and grief rose and died softly in his throat. They would beat him always now, after that. Even she would beat him. They would hunt him down and beat him when they found him. From out of the glow of the fire he turned his wolfish head to the depths of the forest. There were no clubs or stinging lashes out in that gloom. They would never find him there. For another moment he wavered, and then, as silently as one of the wild creatures whose blood was partly his, he stole away into the blackness of the night. End of Chapter 3 of Kazan by James Oliver Curwood. Recording by Leonard Wilson of Springfield, Ohio.